Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today we'll be reacting to why doesn't Indonesia Dutch? Interesting. First time ever seeing this channel. Its link will be in the description. Let's see why they don't speak Dutch, because they used to own this area for a while. Let's see.
I was confused about something. Here in this vast archipelago of islands, why after hundreds of years of Dutch colonial rule, does Indonesia not speak any Dutch today? It's confusing because most former European colonies at least speak some of their former colonizers' language.
Sure.
In Indonesia's next-door neighbor Malaysia, 75% of the population speaks English. So I did some research, and I looked at primary accounts of the people who lived there, and I listened to some big experts on the subject. And I found some things that are surprising, things that were unique to the way the Dutch colonized, and that no other European country was doing. Things that meant that the Dutch language mysteriously disappeared from Indonesia.
The whole of Java have been taken over and run by the self-appointed regime.
These islands are among the richest prizes. Of the total population of some 70 millions, 65 millions were native to the island.
Unlike other European colonial powers at the time, they didn't colonize Indonesia as a nation-state. They did it as a corporation.
Mercantile.
That corporation was called the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC. It had a stock and everything, just like a modern corporation. Its only purpose was to profit off of spices by bringing them from Asia back to Europe. Since the
Would you even call that colonization? What's the colonization part if it was is it they forcefully vetted themselves as the main trade initiator? Or I don't know. It's difficult. It's difficult. What were the challengers to the VOC?
VOC was motivated first by profit. They found it was cheaper and easier for their workers to learn the Malay language rather than teaching people Dutch.
Dutch as the language of its empire. They took the easy way out, which was a clever way out, which was to use a simple local lingua franca as the language of administration. This is the only colony in the world that I know of which is ruled primarily through a non-European language. I mean, it shows you how odd this is. But the reason is because of the VOC.
People in this region had been using Malay as a lingua franca since the 7th century. This is because the Indonesian archipelago is culturally diverse, and people...
Yeah. I was gonna say that if he didn't say it. Just look at all the different people. And that's a lot of people's places where there's just so many, especially once we look at the Papuan area, but more or less, yeah, it would be a nightmare trying to convert people, especially.
People speak over 400 different languages, so in order to communicate between them, they used Malay. Before the Dutch or any Europeans had even set foot in Southeast Asia, the Malacca Sultanate was dominating trade in the region and promoting the Malay language. From the VOC perspective, it was easier for their employees to learn Malay because people already spoke it and the trade routes were already established. This was different from the other European colonizers of the time, like the Spanish and the Portuguese. They were not only aiming to make money, but also to spread Christianity, their culture, and most importantly, their language. The Dutch, not so much. However, this doesn't explain everything. The VOC was eventually nationalized by the Dutch government in 1800, who took full control over the colony. Over the next century, the Dutch expanded the borders of the Indonesian colony from the modest, spice-focused territories to the maximalist conquest of the entire archipelago. Once this happened, they did start to teach Dutch to the local population, but it didn't take hold. Not once, but many times, they speak to us in broken Malay, although they know very well that we understand the Dutch language. That was written by an Indonesian women's rights activist called Kartini, who came from a privileged background in the local aristocracy. The Dutch would often govern via the use of local rulers who had been regional lords under the pre-colonial monarchy of Java. She wrote letters to pen pals in Amsterdam about what life was like in the Dutch East Indies. Even though her background meant that she was taught Dutch at an early age, She noted many times about how Dutch officials wouldn't speak Dutch with her. I know a Dutch official who speaks Malay with a Javan regent, although he knows full well that he speaks good Dutch. Everyone converses with this native ruler in Dutch.
Maybe the default, though, is play.
But the colonial official, never. Dutch education was only available to a small, privileged elite of the locals.
That's what I was thinking too. Like Latin. A long time ago, Latin given to prosperity to roll.
In fact, some locals recalled how children needed to have knowledge in Dutch before going to Dutch school. Without the special permission of the Governor General, no native child from 6 to 7 years old would be admitted to the free grammar school for Europeans that could not speak Dutch. How can a native child of 6 or 7 learn Dutch? He would have had to have a Dutch governess. It shows how, in many cases, it was a chicken and egg problem. How can you learn Dutch if you were never taught, or if Dutch people and officials didn't want to speak it to you? The Dutch established local schools in Indonesia, but not very many.
Seems like an alignment. Yeah.
In 1900, the Dutch East Indies only had 1,500 schools, which equates to one school for every 24,000 people. In 1945, at the end of Dutch colonial rule, only between 5 and 8% of the Indonesian population were literate in the Latin alphabet, hammering home the fact that for colonial officials, teaching Dutch was a secondary thought. Since Malay was so widespread in the colony, the Dutch government decided to make it co-official with Dutch in this period. And this started to plant the first seeds of Indonesian nationalism.
Of course, because you give an inch, it's going to be a mile.
They standardized Malay based on the version from Malacca, and dictionaries were made for governmental communication and schools for local people. So of those schools that were established, many even taught their curriculum in Malay instead of Dutch. This was again really different to how other European powers operated. For example, even though people in North Africa primarily spoke Arabic, the French still made them use French instead. The Dutch, while having some of that, had way less than everyone else. But it
Maybe it's just like the tone.
goes even further than this. The Dutch established a classification system for local Indonesians, which paradoxically helped create a national identity rooted in not speaking Dutch. They put people into 3 groups. The Dutch, which included people of mixed European and Asian race who spoke Dutch. Foreign Easterners, such as Arabs, Chinese, Indians, and those who weren't from Indonesia. And finally, the most important one, inlanders. Like I mentioned before, Indonesia is made up of hundreds of different groups with different languages and cultures. The Dutch classified them as being part of the same group, called inlanders, to which the Dutch would speak Malay to them. To the Dutch colonizers, everyone was just...
Maybe it's a good default, though. It's not everyone. Malay for it. Good thought here.
Just an Indonesian colonial subject, regardless of their local background.
But inlanders mean, of course, that you belong there. And the fact is, from the Dutch point of view, it didn't matter whether you were Sundanese or Muslim or Christian or from New Guinea or whatever it was, you were all the same. You were inlanders. And this has a powerful impact too. That is, it persuades people in the long run that in some way they really are the same. And if you're inlandser, you belong there, you were a native.
And the Dutch didn't.
The Dutch are not natives.
Yes.
And therefore, in a sense, the logic of the Dutch expression itself tells...
Excluded themselves from Indonesia.
That's right. Yes.
This paradoxically ended up solidifying Indonesian national identity. That all of these different groups, like Javanese,
Look at all these. Crazy. But if you're from India, hello, I love connecting.
Sundanese, Sumatrans, Moluccans, and Balinese were all the same people, and that their common language was Malay, not Dutch. When students from all over the archipelago met up in a central location to be educated, the cultural differences between them were decreased, and they started to see themselves as inlanders. In October 1928, young Indonesian nationalists from across the islands and from different backgrounds gathered at the Second Youth Congress in Jakarta. This was a defining moment in the birth of Indonesian national identity because they pledged 3 main points. 1. A united motherland. 2. A united nation. And most importantly, 3. A unifying language.
Malay.
The language that they ended up choosing was Indonesian.
Oh.
Indonesian? Okay, what's Indonesian?
Yeah.
Indonesian is Malay, sort of. Remember when the Dutch officials tried to standardize Malay and create dictionaries for it and use it to formally administer the colonies? It ended up creating a variety of Malay that was more Indonesian. At this conference, they formally decided that this branch of Malay would be known as Indonesian.
Okay, so Malay and so Spanish. Those two.
Indonesian is mutually intelligible with Malay. It's the same base language with some differences, and 2 speakers of these languages could easily communicate with one another.
I wonder why they were showcasing volume.
The-
Have a couple other countries have like some. Because Filipinos obviously Philippines are not the same.
And 2 speakers of these languages could easily communicate with one another. The biggest difference is that Indonesian does have many loanwords from Dutch. There's a whole list on Wikipedia of all of the Dutch words in Indonesian. Supposedly, as high as around 1/5 of the entire Indonesian language can be traced back to Dutch origins. There's good videos on YouTube of Dutch and Indonesian speakers comparing some of the similarities between words.
Tas. A bag.
Yeah. You had from the end of the 19th century already Malay language newspapers and the rise of the vernacular press. I mean, if this elite there had been no Malay, and this was simply a Dutch-speaking elite, which happens in other colonies, I think it would have been a very thin stratum with not much connection to the mass.
Malay was adopted to an Indonesian context. It took local words, changed its grammar a bit, and the Indonesian nationalists saw it as a unifying language of the people. The nationalists could have chosen Javanese as the language of the state, since it was the mother tongue of almost half of all Indonesians.
Dang.
But nobody in any area outside of Java would have spoken it, so it wouldn't have unified these diverse cultures. During World War II, the Japanese occupied Indonesia, and they didn't administer the country in Dutch or Japanese. They did it in Indonesian. They issued propaganda espousing how Japan was saving the peoples of Indonesia from Western colonialism, and many people sympathized with that. They also freed anti-colonial dissidents like Sukarno, who the Dutch had previously banished to the remote island of Flores. The Japanese thought that they could use dissidents like Sukarno to pacify the local population. But Sukarno saw it the other way. He could use Japan to free Indonesia. Sukarno was willing to support the Japanese in exchange for a platform to spread his nationalist ideas. Yes, independent Indonesia can only be achieved with Dai Nippon. He was vindicated for thinking this way because in 1943, with the war going badly, the Japanese administration promised Indonesia could gain full independence at some point. Sukarno used this as a fuel on the nationalist fire to further promote his ideas of a unified Indonesian state to the public. After Japan's defeat in the war, the Dutch tried to reassert control over Indonesia, but it didn't work.
Of course not.
Indonesia fought an anti-colonial war against the Dutch and won, gaining their independence in 1949. The new president, Sukarno, declared a unified Indonesian nation, whose national language would be Indonesian. The Republic of Indonesia is not owned by a group, does not belong to a religion, not owned by a tribe, not owned by a custom class, and it belongs to all of us, from Sabang to Merauke. Any remaining Dutch speakers left to the Netherlands or stopped speaking Dutch in their daily life. Today, almost nobody speaks Dutch in Indonesia, although actually, most people never did.
Yeah, very interesting video here. I mean, it was like a hot. It really Dutch. lived here. Then you utilize a war, utilize imperialism, really turn movement into something that becomes a country. Super cool, very interesting. Don't know too much about Indonesia. Very enlightening. Go around it. They got so much more Indonesia. Oh, that'd be interesting. No. But besides that, let me know if you have a recommendation. Have one. Subscribe if you haven't already.